So, for the past 15 years or so, we have endeavored to bring a common thread to each summer. And we've gone from picking 5 full books to creating our own readers to many ramifications of it. This past fall, the graduate committee was looking for its subject or its topic for the seminar for the summer, and performance was brought up. Performance has been brought up every year for many years. It's always been a question of how does it relate to this program, and we've always tried to be inclusive with it, not to set it off as a separate thing, but to include it in each discipline by bringing faculty in each discipline that is based in performance. Over the years, we've had Yvonne Rayner, we've had Joan Jonas, we've had Carolyn Schneeman, just to name a few. So with that in mind, it just so happened that a member of one of our faculty members in film theory who's taught with us for a number of years, Malik, had just published a book called Black Performances on the Outskirts of the Left, A History of the Impossible. So we thought that might be a good place to start. So we've invited Malik to take this week and structure it with us into a week based in performance. And we've got quite a schedule in front of you. Malik is the assistant professor of performance studies in the New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and is a member of the performance group, The Barbarians. I screwed it up, I'm sorry. What? I was. So without any further embarrassment, I want to introduce Malik Gaines.
Thank you, Arthur. Thanks, Arthur. This is a trip, y'all. Thank you, Bard, for inviting me. This is really wonderful. Let me take a sip of water. So I understand that many of you have read at least many pages of my book. And as you can see, there's a lot going on. It's a particularly performance studies approach, which means there's theater studies, cinema studies, black studies, some light musicology, some art history. It's an interdisciplinary area that I studied in at UCLA, and I'm happy to work in the department at NYU now at Tisch. And so it's complicated to put a lecture together to encapsulate all of what happens here, particularly as I sort of outline these 3 spheres in the introduction: blackness, the 60s, and the transnational. So I tried to cut a little slice out of this that would be interesting, at least, for us today. I have a few sections from chapter 2, a few sections from the afterword, some notes for chit-chat, though I'm probably going to forget all the key things I want to say, and a couple of little activities for us. We have a 2-hour block here, and I'm thinking this is like an hour 20, so we can have some Q&A at the end about general questions about the book, and and I also have a section of something I wrote recently about a painter that ties into what I'm discussing today. If it seems like it's going too long, I can skip that at the end, but I thought it'd be interesting. If I can see on your faces if you're like falling asleep and getting too bored, so I'll try and keep that in mind, but I might just go on and on. So thank you for coming, thank you for being a part of this, and I thought I would start. I dug up a picture from Facebook of me at a Bard party in like 2010 wearing a funny kind of Jamaican African hat. And that was a good starting place, I thought. I thought perhaps we could listen to a song to get in the mood at first. This discussion of the transnational that I pull out of my book has to do with locating a circulation of Black political work, images, and their articulation in specific performances of the 60s. And of course, Ghana serves as a key site there. This I try, probably firstly attached to an African American and diasporic imagination of Africa. And secondly, given my sort of point of view and expertise, the interest in particularly Ghana at that time of tapping into and mobilizing that circulation. And so one example of a kind of Black American fantasy, I'll call it, of Africa is this Abby Lincoln song called Africa from this recording she did in Japan in '73. If you can see any of the text there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff about her international travels and reaching this place. And this is, she has these incredible sort of, really good kind of cocktail jazz records from the late 50s, and then she did a couple things with her husband Max Roach in the mid 60s, and then after he passed away, I think this is one of her first kind of like major recordings that I ever discovered. And of course she's very prolific in the 90s and zeros and 80s up until the time of her death. This is called Africa.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear at some point from you musicians and others what you hear in there. A couple of things that stand out to me. And I used to listen to this like when I was in college and get stoned and turn off the lights, and I would get really into it. And there's this super expressive kind of exuberance around this idea of Africa, which both is a home, right, but also tied to that is this permanent homelessness, this constant roaming. I went to Paris, I went here and there. I guess I'm bound to constantly move. And so there's a kind of ambivalence in this image, at least, that I think is really interesting. And milk and honey is a kind of biblical image of Israel, right? There's a kind of mythologic dimension to this. There's not a lot of dairy in African diets, and she describes meeting different heads of state and hanging out with Miriam Makeba and other things in this description at the bottom. And so, of course, I had a kind of connection to this image of Africa, but like many people who come from the States or educated in the West, I didn't have a very good education, right? One of the reasons I wanted to focus on this chapter is because I think it's probably the least attended to chapter so far, and there are reasons for that. One of them is that it's kind of the most basic theater studies, and maybe is a little dry in that sense. But also I think people are intimidated by their lack of preparation to speak knowledgeably about Africa. And that would have even prohibited me from writing this chapter. When I went to a conference in Ghana once and met the scholar Sandra Richards, I told her what I was doing as a kind of performance studies scholar, not steeped in sort of 10 years of research. And she's like, well, that's bold. The academic structure sort of requires a certain kind of expertise, and I'm sure many of you here feel the same way that I do, that you don't really know that much about Africa. I definitely never learned Tree, the language that comes up a lot in my research. And I took an undergrad art history class that was back then in the 90s. It was called the Art History of Africa, Oceania, and Native America, which is a kind of, vestige of being an Orientalist, which was a, legitimate feature of that discipline at the time. And I took an African history class sometime after the Rodney King riots. Me and all the black students showed up in this African history class and were shocked that there was a white professor. But of course, this is sort of the structure of the academy, and the people who have had this sort of ability to do that kind of deep dive research are very often people who are already authorized in scholarship to have that kind of access and agency. But at the same time, it's not unknowable, right? This is part of the perpetuating problem that the kind of darkness of Africa, the kind of inability to have any sort of substantial knowledge from our Western perspective means that we can never know anything, right? So I really thought it was important, and one of the reasons and then I took a couple of graduate art history seminars with Stephen Nelson at UCLA, and I came into doing my PhD thinking really about the work that had been influencing and inspiring my work as an artist and a performer, and in My Barbarian especially, we were very conscious of sort of situating a legacy of 60s stuff that as Californians, as people of our generation, reflecting on what Alex's teacher Mary Kelly called our political primal scene, we were trying to sort of unpack what that meant in the Bush era. And I went in with a kind of set of performances that are in the book that I was really focused on, and but I didn't really have the language to deal with Brazil, which was one of the things I was fascinated by. But then I discovered that there's all this kind of stuff in English around this transnational moment in Ghana. Of course, Ghana and Nigeria are both were English colonies, and so there is this complicated Anglophonic presence there, course, if you don't know, Ghana's over there on the southern part of West Africa. Notably three gigantic fortresses are there that were built by the Portuguese in Accra and in Cape Coast and in Elmina that are sort of the famous slave castles that are sites of tourism now. While I was digging into this, a few important books came up, particularly Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, which is her second book after her hugely monumental Scenes of Subjection, which is sort of brought a kind of what we can call Black studies now has been really sort of influenced by Hortense Spillers, who influenced Saidiya Hartman, who influenced Fred Moten, and now we're at this kind of incredibly high philosophical moment in the field. And Hartman's first book, of course, lays out some of the sort of key tenets of the kind of negativity we see around the idea of Black subjecthood, using American studies. But her second book is a memoir, a critical memoir about tourism to Ghana, time she spent in Ghana, and the sort of impossibility of going home to find your home there. Very different perspectives between Black Americans and people of the diaspora and West Africans about what went down there. Not really on the same page after all. So I'm going to read a little bit here. Africa has served as a central site and symbol in the Black transnational discourse described throughout these chapters and represented in the imaginative performances discussed here. Commenting on her first trip to the continent in 1962, Nina Simone remembered, "I knew I had arrived somewhere important and that Africa mattered to me and would always matter. Having traveled on a cultural mission with Langston Hughes, the singer Odetta, and a number of other Black American artists to Lagos, Nigeria, the entourage represented a coalition among performers, writers, and intellectuals who shared an interest in Black empowerment and identified in African liberation efforts its possible elaboration. The notion of Africa as a homeland for non-African Blacks has worked doubly as a romantic image and a political concept. At once an imagined origin, a site of traumatic subjugation, and a utopian destination, Africa has persistently symbolized both impossibility and invention in the diaspora. For many, including Simone, the historic forced separation from Africa in the form of transatlantic slavery was a source of the alienated experience of Black American life. Another way I sort of ended up here was by following Du Bois around, and of course, Souls of Black Folks is something people come up, have read in Black History Month in high school, and is a sort of major achievement and a kind of leading articulation of Black American political thought at the turn of the last century. And Du Bois, of course, did sociological studies, did fiction, founded all sorts of cultural organizations, theater troupes, magazines, and traveled, a really interesting route. He's known for, getting a PhD at Harvard. I guess he's the first African American person to do that. But he taught in the South. He studied before that in Germany, where he learned from sort of leading sociologists from the end of the 19th century, which influences very positivist approach to say, look, if we can only show through facts that racism is irrational, we can eradicate that. He wrote some really weird fiction. He's not the most elegant writer, but it's super interesting. There's a novel called Dark Princess that starts, there's a protagonist, it's so him, that starts hanging out in Berlin, and he meets this underground cell of elites of color from around the world, and this cool princess of South Asia, and gets into her, and he goes on this kind of journey where he ends up ups and downs. He's back in the States, he becomes a Pullman porter, he's traveling the railroads, he's in Chicago, he's building the subway as a worker, then he becomes a congressman, and all this stuff happens, a lot of really weird hetero hijinks. And then he and his South Asian princess wife and his poor old black mother from the South are all reconciled through some like birthing scene at the end. So he has a lot invested in this movement, and he was a founder of the Pan-Africanist movement, and I think this comes back up in the paper. So, and he held on to this, I'll say positivist method for a very long time, and also is a bit of an elitist, and he always wrote against socialism and communism in his early writing. And finally, by the 60s, when he's in his 90s and had been to China and had been expelled from the United States, basically, the State Department refused to renew his passport. He and Nkrumah invited him to Ghana, where he retired and became a sort of elder state figure, and that's where he died. As I say, Du Bois had died in Ghana the day before the 1963 March on Washington, D.C. On the summer afternoon in 2009, when I visited his grave in the capital, Accra, I was confronted by two African-American performers of international magnitude. Upon entering the small gazebo that had been built to entomb Du Bois only feet away from the Pan-Africanist Cultural Center that was once his residence, I acknowledged the sense of emotion that I had come to associate with such pilgrimage sites. Strikingly, at this moment, I heard the familiar voice of Beyoncé singing a stirring ballad. The pop star's voice was emitting from a small audio device held by a teenage boy who was sitting in the open passageway of the structure. The boy appeared to be local. He was repeatedly listening to one of Beyoncé's then current hit songs, If I Were a Boy. The song narrates a heterosexual yet gender-crossing fantasy in which the singer brings a performative critique to the construction of masculinity. If I were a boy, I think I could understand how it feels to love a girl. I swear I'd be a better man. Beyoncé's performance of Diva has served as a platform for an amplified voice, one that resonates both globally. I was just in Berlin, and they were about to come to the Olympia Stadium to perform there. In the field of commodities and transnationally, as in the strange black identificatory conundrum happening among the boy, Du Bois, Beyoncé, and me in that Ghanaian gazebo. After sitting for a minute on a ceremonial stool, I left to explore the grounds, where I soon ran into Danny Glover, the African-American movie star and activist. He was visiting the center for a conference associated with Panafest. I had attended other festival events in the previous week that had troubled notions of originality and authenticity with reenactments of Black American alienation. These included a young Ghanaian theater ensemble's amateur play about the slave trade performed inside a 16th century fortress, speeches from culture ministers promoting diasporic tourism to slave sites, a march to a memorial grave for former American slaves who had returned to Ghana, and a large reggae concert where I had previously run into Danny Glover. On the second occasion, on a walkway near a golden bust of Du Bois, I approached the actor. "May I take your photograph, Mr. Glover?" I asked. Glover gave me a thumbs up sign as I documented his presence with my mobile device. I thought I had lost this photo until this week. The blurry image in its context suggests the complicity of performance in producing a Black transnational political discourse. This discourse conveys psychic content, as in the identifications between disempowered people and images of Black expression that exceed negative constraints. The discourse is also a material consequence of the physical dissemination of these images and texts, facilitated by travelers. While the Black Transnational Network is not a recognized political body capable of bestowing and defending official rights, it is a place of imagination where different models of being and belonging can be performed. The notion of imagination can be creative and playful, as in many of the expressive choices made by the performers discussed here, but it is also a political mode. Arjuna Paudurai has argued that works of the imagination create a collective platform from which to project notions of, quote, resistance, irony, selectivity, and in general, agency, in italics. This collective imagination can be directed more potently than the aimless fantasy, and is broadened by a community's access to circulating images and the experiences of migration. In the Black transnational context, this imaginative space has been shaped by people with extraordinary access and privilege, such as Du Bois and Josephine Baker, who I discussed earlier, but has informed a widely accessible terrain of imagination that it cannot be described exclusively in elite terms, as the proximity between me, the Ghanaian teenager, and Du Bois's remains suggests. Another such anecdote comes from the biography of Black Panther Party leader Elaine Brown, who remembers her working-class grandmother's own fond memories of Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, recalling a time when he, as a college student at Lincoln University, had visited her home in Pittsburgh. Nkrumah had played saxophone with a family friend. There is an understanding in this telling that African liberation and American inner-city difficulty are part of the same struggle. In this sense, imagination is a potent political tool for envisioning solidarities beyond those authorized by state control and international economic conditions. Also evident in many examples found here is that performance links imagination to expressivity, producing real articulations of potential power. So I wanted to sort of cruise through chapter 2 a little bit and mention some of the works I discussed there. This is the conclusion, I think. Adufa and Foria by F.W. Sutherland and The Dilemma of a Ghost by Ama-Ata Edu are three plays from Ghana's liberation period that elaborate a critical rather than utopian vision of African subjectivity. In these works, local content, European forms, and transnational political perspectives are suspended in a field of relation, never fully resolving into each other. Differences remain and produce enduring conflicts. By staging Black subjectivities in conflict, these plays demonstrate that modernity and tradition are themselves notions fraught with contradiction and produce ambivalences that exceed the boundaries of the nation-state. Ghanaian statehood created the space for this critical position, instigating a theater that spoke against the colonial era's prohibitions. These combinations of differences set in tension between ideas of progress and continuity, form a provisional position from which to speak, a position which resists the masculinist state of synthesis in which difference is obliterated. This is Nkrumah's idea of African personality. The discomfort of difference is always present within these dramas, and this discomfort must continually be encountered in the experience of Black transnationalism. From an African perspective, reconciliation with diasporic Blacks was an important element of post-colonial liberation projects, particularly according to the program of Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah. While the histories that lead to the 60s had produced more immediate political problems than American slavery for Africans, slavery's forced displacements had created transnational avenues that could be retraced back to the continent. Among the artists who made this journey, Simone's travels to Nigeria and Liberia helped shape her worldview. Simone's friend Miriam Makeba, in exile from South Africa and fleeing the United States, settled at this time in Guinea with her husband Stokely Carmichael, where she recorded liberation-themed music for the state's record company, singing in multiple languages of the Black world. Major art festivals in Senegal and Cape Verde helped shape a transnational concept of Black expressivity in the 60s. These countries' leaders have been influenced by events in Ghana, where a nexus of international visitors and local cultural initiatives were instrumental in this process of post-colonial redefinition. The image of this Black transnationalism was mobilized in the 1963 Ghanaian state funeral for Du Bois, who had retired there. As in many Black cultures, funerals are of great importance in the Akan traditions of Ghana, and Du Bois's affirmed the state's political mission by incorporating both local and Western forms of performative mourning. As Du Bois' biographer David Lovering Lewis reports, the proceedings included a laying in state where dignitaries and visitors could pay respects, a processional along the beach attended by thousands, and a first burial on the grounds of the former slave fortress that still serves as the seat of government. The details of the ceremony allude to the variety of cultural influences at play in Ghana at the time. African libations were poured and chants were recited. A Christian hymn system was performed. Red, gold, and green liberation-colored cords were wrapped around the coffin as it rested beneath the Chinese lantern. Soviet limousines carried the bereaved throughout the processional as elite Ghanaian infantry executed the, quote, distinctive ceremonial glide, the famous slow march learned from British drill masters. These foreign influences complemented the local emphasis on funerals, setting the stage for a post-colonial nation-state invested in its past and embedded in a mixed modernity. Following the ceremony, Nkrumah read Du Bois's final message, written years earlier in a radio address. This is Nkrumah reading Du Bois. "I have loved my work, I have loved people and my play, but always I have been uplifted by the thought that what I have done will live long and justify my life. That what I have done ill or never finished can now be handed on to others for endless days to be finished perhaps better than I could have done, and that peace will be my applause." In this speech, Nkrumah adopts Du Bois's own first-person I, suggesting that it would be he who would finish the other Americans' unfinished work. This act of surrogation indicates the intergenerational depth of the present moment of liberation as it was being enacted in this time and place. The imagery of play and applause suggests Du Bois possessed self-awareness of the important cultural role he had performed as the innovator of Pan-Africanist thinking, a role he had passed on to Nkrumah for 2 decades. This state performance marked the end of Du Bois's life while presenting continuity between his life's work and the future of Africa. After independence in 1957, the Ghanaian leadership sought to create new institutions that could counter the colonial legacy, cultural projects that would emphasize a specifically African formation of subjectivity. This subjectivity was devalued under the colonial authority, particularly through an education system that disparaged African traditions. The transformation of the British Gold Coast into an independent Ghana began a process of black autonomy that intervened against the European notion of history itself, one that proposed a white subject as its universal agent. And renaming the Gold Coast after an ancient kingdom that shared some territory with the British colony, Nkrumah's African agency broke radically with the recent past and signaled a distant past worthy of recuperation in order to instantiate a progressive future. This renaming was a prominent symbol of the effort to create an African agency founded in African subjectivity. This subjectivity, or African personality, as Nkrumah called it, managed many contradictions. A universal figure that is specifically raced, an agent of modernity whose authority precedes the influence of European methodologies, and an ideal citizen who locates an authentic situation among regional practices, a national liberation agenda, and a Pan-Africanist ideology. African personality demonstrates an ambitious synthesis. Nkrumah's vanguard cultural initiatives combated the effects of what Valentine Mudimbe has described as alienation. Alienation comes up all around this book, and we can think about it in relationship to Marx, we can think about it in relationship to Brecht, and we can think about it in relationship to Simone, and I guess all of modernity probably. The colonized is the object of the political fact of domination, but also internalizes this position through the subjective experience of domination. In a dialectical arrangement, negritude and black personality, used here as synonyms in a quote that I skipped, form an antithetical movement against the premise of European domination. The struggle for liberation results from what is imagined as an authentic African embodiment, but this image of real presence is paradoxically invoked as firstly a radical negation. The alienated situation of domination makes possible an empowered subjective position, articulated through intellect and emotion, beyond the object status of the colonized. Importantly, African originality is imagined here as an after effect of the colony. It is only in the symbolic violence of the colony that this black personality emerges. While citing Fanon's anti-racism, Mudimbe equates black personality with negritude. Negritude is a concept commonly attributed to Martinican author Aimé Césaire, though Brett Hayes Edwards convincingly traces the term's origin to Jane Nardal in Paris. It was most firmly codified in the African context by Senegal's first president, Nkrumah's ally, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who picked it up in Paris from his fellow transnational intellectuals. The idea of negritude, which described an authentic African identity rooted in the very fact of blackness, influenced liberation ideologies in Francophone regions, and was met with ambivalence by Wole Soyinka's famous quip, quote, "A tiger does not speak of his tigertude." While an essential biological Africanness is perhaps even more pronounced in the concept of negritude than in the Anglophonic Pan-Africanist tradition, Nkrumah's idea of African personality certainly mobilizes essentialist strains that connect race, geographical origin, and shared political experience into a biologically grounded nationalist identity. African personality and negritude illustrate a politicized cultural effort that spanned the continent while also speaking to blacks across the diaspora. Its promise was to mine resources buried within black bodies and turn those materials into modern instruments of self-determination. This self-determined state was, through the image of a shared cultural source, presented as a scene of reconciliation and reunion for all Africans and all those of African descent. Negritude and African personality were the means toward a black utopia. Importantly, according to their theorists, the cultural possibilities of African independence were grounded in an essentialist idea of an a priori Africanness. Its cultural authority was sustained by the biological premise, which countered the European essentialist notion of supremacy that authorized the latter's colonizing powers. I think I pushed that a little hard. I might have made that a little different. Nkrumah, who throughout his presidency kept the comic actor Ajax Buchanan as a court jester, asserted a sustained interest in performance. According to Kwabena Nketia, quote, "It is because of this interest that he instituted the National Theater movement shortly after independence. It was his experience of some of the best African-American modes of expression which he used as his yardstick," as he points out. Quote, "What other countries have taken 300 years or more to achieve, a once dependent territory must try to achieve in a generation." Nkrumah's Pan-Africanist experience exposed him to Black American theater, which was among his inspirations in supporting a theater movement. Lorraine Hansberry's 1958 play, A Raisin in the Sun, was a prominent example of Black American drama that was known to Ghana's intellectuals in the early years of independence, having been performed in 1963 in Accra's Ghana Playhouse. In the American context, Hansberry's play provided a critical Black subjectivity to New York theater, using a conventional realist idiom to challenge racist premises. In the post-colonial situation in Ghana, a similar move was being choreographed using Black American expressivity as a template for action. Among the new liberatory institutions proposed by Nkrumah was the National Theater Movement. In his 1958 autobiography, Nkrumah offers some perspective on theater. He writes of his time at Teachers Training College in Accra, quote, "During my third year at Achimota, I became interested in amateur dramatics and played the title role in a house play called Kofi Goes Abroad, a study of the student who went to England to study medicine and the difficulties he encountered with the witch doctors. He proved to the people that his scientific knowledge could outwit superstition and witchcraft." Nkrumah learned early in his education about the pedagogical uses of theater. It's instructive that Nkrumah includes this moment in his autobiography. The scene depicts Nkrumah as the leading actor performing Kofi, an industrious Ghanaian who had studied abroad, a character type of which Nkrumah would later become the ultimate example. In this scene, Nkrumah/Kofi uses knowledge acquired in Europe to outwit superstition, setting up a dialectical conflict in which Nkrumah Kofi is the agent who synthesizes European knowledge and African practice. In Nkrumah's memory, theater was a place where ideology could be performed in a dress rehearsal for political reality. Within this cultural effort, the writer F.W. Sutherland emerged as the leader of the fledgling national theater movement. Sutherland's works were in direct dialogue with the emergent Ghanaian nation-state. Kwabena Nketia, who was the first director of the African Studies Institute at the University of Ghana, Nkrumah fired all of the English people from the university and just sort of started over. Remembers the cultural scene at this time. Nketia says, "There were also my close friends who were associates of Nkrumah, such as F.W. Sutherland of blessed memory, with whom I worked very closely and who briefed Nkrumah from time to time on the status of the arts or offered suggestions. As a perceptive writer and philosopher in her own right, F.W. Sutherland was someone Nkrumah listened to sometimes with rapt attention. She could advise or even criticize him where others might hesitate. I remember her telling me about an action on which she strongly disagreed with Nkrumah and pressed him to reverse it. But this was too much for him to accept, so he left her abruptly after telling her to her face that even his own mother would not dare to talk to him in that manner. This did not slam the door on the arts, for Nkrumah had a soft spot for creative people of Efwa's intellectual caliber. This passage indicates Sutherland's particular role in the new artistic production. Sutherland was an actor on the stage of state, an advisor with unusual access to Nkrumah himself, respected by her colleagues. Sutherland's work combined cultural advocacy with creative expression. Far from proposing an autonomous artistic position, Sutherland's work was embedded in the political and historical situation of independent Ghana. Sutherland's plays must be read in the context of her broad project of cultural advocacy. After having studied in Accra and Cambridge, Sutherland went to work in Ghana to create and promote African writing, building an enduring legacy as a playwright, director, teacher, specialist in children's theater, author, advisor to Nkrumah and later President Jerry Rawlings, and general facilitator of Ghanaian culture. Sutherland's daughter, Essie Sutherland Addy, and Anne Adams write as co-editors of the volume, The Legacy of Efwa Sutherland. Quote, like many intellectuals and cultural activists of the independence generation, Efwa Sutherland saw herself as an African with responsibilities that included the representation and validation of indigenous thought, values, and knowledge, the fashioning of new institutions and systems of thought. The responsibility of the independence generation was to substitute an indigenous African cultural inheritance, substantiate an indigenous African cultural inheritance, but this indigenous Africa is problematized by the colonial influence under which Africans of this generation achieved maturity. Despite the call to present locally grounded concepts and aesthetics, Sutherland herself expressed the task of fulfilling this responsibility as a journey. This is Sutherland. I'm on a journey of discovery. I'm discovering my own people. I didn't grow up in rural Ghana. I grew up in Cape Coast with a Christian family. It's a fine family, but there are certain hidden areas of Ghanaian life, important areas of Ghanaian life that I just wasn't in touch with. In the past 4 or 5 years, I made a very concentrated effort to make that untrue, and I feel I know my people now. The Ghana Drama Studio, founded by Sutherland, produced original African dramas, including Sutherland's own plays, Adufa and Foriwa. It was with the drama studio players that Sutherland also developed her third drama, The Marriage of Anansiwa, after the end of Nkrumah's regime. Known as the mother of Ghana's national theater movement, a nickname that credits a traditional feminine figure with the origin of a radically innovative institution, Akan structures are matrilineal, which doesn't mean there's no sexism, but which means that there are certain powers associated with motherly figures. A nickname that credits a traditional female figure with the origin of a radically innovative institution. Sutherland created performance works that resonate with the notion of African personality, and that they were original Ghanaian products made from the various sources of African modernity. However, Sutherland's plays present the perilous complexity of this modern character as it is problematized by gender, class, and cultural identity. Sutherland's artistic voice was initiated by the independence movement itself. Speaking of her decision to write serious plays, Sutherland claimed it was, quote, the outcome of my starting the Ghana Writers' Society after independence, September 1957. I started that all of a sudden because I felt that a newly independent country needed a force of creative writers. The Ghana Writers' Society was only the first of many organizations that Sutherland founded to support Ghanaian artistic production after independence, and these organizations were embarked upon with some level of government support and were identified as Ghanaian national projects. Adufa, which premiered in November 1962, was presented within this frame of original cultural products engaged with the priorities of the independence government. Sutherland may have been cast as the traditional mother of the national theater movement, but she had traveled and met as illustrious travelers. Her own experiences were shaped by the internationalism of the Pan-Africanist politics that shaped Ghanaian independence. African independence movements were affected by the influence of European, Black American, Caribbean, and Chinese sources, all contributing to the era's international discourse of liberation politics, and Soviet as well. Sutherland's husband, William Sutherland, was a Black American who was engaged in transnational political organizing. Sutherland was herself well-traveled and met many international visitors in Accra, which at the time of independence was a mecca for leaders of Black leftist liberation efforts. As a prelude to forming the Ghana Writer Society, Sutherland cited a trip she took in 1957 to the Tashkent Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Soviet Uzbekistan, where she realized the importance of producing African literary works. That this lesson was learned abroad at a communist writers' conference is compatible with the African Marxist philosophy that Nkrumah was pursuing at home in Ghana. Sutherland was also among the Ghanaians who met with traveling visitors to Accra. She described the independence event from her own perspective. And then independence itself. I was terribly excited about independence. I had been excited about it for 2 or 3 years, and then it actually happened. Ghana was the first independent state, of course. The day it happened, there were a lot of people at that time, including Martin Luther King. He and Coretta King came. I actually was with them on the night of the transition. We went to the Midnight Parliament, the first parliament they put together. Then we came out, and I remember very clearly in the streets outside with Nkrumah and all those people saying, "Ghana is free forever." We watched the Ghana flag go up and the British flag come down. Very, very exciting times. I'm not surprised that that moved. With that inspiration and that excitement, and he, Martin Luther King, he was moved too. Actually, I heard him say, "Free at last," that night, in the street that early morning. He echoed the "free at last" statement at that moment. And this is 57, right? This is early in, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is getting going, and some of these early, big demonstrations are going, but we're not quite at the March on Washington, right? These anecdotes underscore Ghana's place in a transnational Black network. Sutherland's own story demonstrates her participation in the international discourse. Sutherland was herself an actor in Ghana's Pan-Africanist movement. Also, looking at this, uncovered a sort of trail of funding that she got from the Rockefellers for development in the developing world with these kind of carefully worded grant applications. And these were to build things at the University of Both Sciences and Arts, and you see sort of what later becomes the problem of aid and development as sort of resuscitating a colonial mode. One of the reasons we don't see a kind of progression from here to the present that might have been imagined at the time by these participants, right? I talk deeply about a few of the plays in the chapter, and you can read that section. Dufa is an interesting one I dwell on because it's an adaptation of Alcestis, which is, I'm blanking now, is it Euripides? It's kind of wacky, so it must be Euripides, right? It's pretty wacky. It's like, there's a dude, Admetos, I think, who, he like avoids a curse that he's gonna get by passing it on to his wife. And then she becomes very sick, and everyone's upset, and Hercules is a friend of his, and he's kind of like a funny buffoon, and he actually wrestles death at the end and then saves Alcestis, the wife. And so it has a weird tone to it. It's both kind of a tragedy and a comedy at the same time. And you see English 18th century paintings of like this hunky Hercules wrestling death as like a pale lady lies on her deathbed. And F. Sutherland talks about her influence in school, where the nuns made them do classic Greek tragedy, and she loved them. She talks about really there being no basis for the kind of theater where we sit in this arrangement, right? Like you sit there in rows, there's a raised platform, and then action plays out there. Of course, that's a European convention that, Europe in its sort of neoclassical phases very handily attributes to Athens, and thus proving that, colonial modern Europe is a continuous extension from classical antiquity in Athens, which, that's a far-fetched claim, but it's something we've all sort of swallowed. So I think it's really interesting the way she sort of inverts that inheritance and says, well, actually, classical antiquity from the Mediterranean could also be traced into contemporary African ideas, just as much as it can be a basis for English ideas. But in this one, Alcestis dies. Hercules doesn't succeed. The character's more like a traveling Pan-Africanist kind of clown guy, but he can't save the wife from the greed of her husband, who's made all of these deals to basically become a capitalist. Foriwa is a nice drama about a village and a kind of typical young woman comes back to town after her training at the university, and she kind of doesn't want to do things right, and there's an itinerant stranger who wants to do like public works programs, but the traditions of the town prohibit anyone from doing anything interesting. But the woman's mother is the queen mother of the town, so she's kind of supportive, and in the end they kind of get some stuff going. It's nice. But like the Sutherland, the drama studio, and the one I showed you, which is a replica, I showed you a sign of, the replica that's built at the university, is a kind of outdoor, maybe octagonal, open air kind of courtyard structure to be this kind of hybrid between kind of African performance and a Western theater, where of course there's a storytelling tradition of Anansi the spider. There are different kinds of masquerades and dances, and these are the kinds of closest things to theater that can be sort of mined out of Akan traditions. And of course I think similar up above is the Asante Kingdom, which is different, I know less about, but they have some similar uses of these materials. And then there's the marriage of Anansiwa, which I don't write about, which uses the storytelling tradition of Anansi the spider and makes a kind of comic play out of it. And Anansi is a trickster who's always up to no good and scheming, but always kind of comes out on top. I thought it might be fun to like read a scene, but I need a reader. I have a couple little scenes from African plays. I hereby bestow upon you the right to perform African characters in African plays. I'll even come back to that idea in a minute. But would somebody be willing to read a little funny scene? You have to be able to read some small text up here. Yeah, I see a hand almost going up. Yeah. Okay, come on. You want to do the next one? Here, come do the next one. I'm going to come do this one. Daughter, and you're going to play Nancy the dad. We're going to both be the players, and when it's like that, we're going to try and sing at the same time, okay? Oh, life is a struggle, oh, life is a pain, oh, life is a struggle, oh, life is a pain in this world. Life is a struggle, citizens, life is a pain in this world. Life is a struggle, friends, life is a pain in this world.
When life is whipping you, rain also pours down to whip you some more. Whatever it was that man did wrong at the beginning of things must have been really awful for all of us to have to suffer so. Anansiwa, where is that typewriter of yours? Bring it here. I've been thinking until my head is earthquaking. Won't somebody who thinks he has discovered the simple solution for living this life kindly step forward and help out the rest of us? Brother, could it be you? Mother, how about you? Nobody?
Oh, the world is hard, the world is really hard.
Anansiwa, where is that typewriter I bought for you at a price that nearly drove me to sell myself? Bring it here.
Oh, Father, is it raining?
Yes, it's raining. It's rain combining with life to beat your father down.
Oh, I didn't even know you were not in the house.
Going and coming is necessary. Otherwise, nothing succeeds. I went to buy paper. Here is typing paper. Here is carbon paper. Here are envelopes. Sit down with the machine.
Ah, I was coming to tell you I was going out.
My daughter, it isn't well with the home. Therefore, sit down, open up the machine I bought for your training, and let the tips of your finger give some service from the training for which I'm paying. I have very urgent letters to write.
Just when I was going out?
Daughter, mine. It's your future I'm thinking about. So put the machine down and get ready to help me.
Take paper, get set while I reflect. Get set while I collect my thoughts together.
I'm stirring up all the brains in my head.
Take paper while I cogitate. I'm ready.
Don't frown, my daughter. Have patience with your father. You are a child yet, in spite of your body's development. You cannot see as far as your father can. There you sit looking lovely, and it's exciting for you to go out in all your beauty. That is all you know. But tell me, won't you return home here afterwards?
I will return home here, why not?
And when you return, will your fees for EP secretarial school be paid?
No.
Haven't you stayed at home for nearly 2 weeks because your fees are owing? And am I not still straining to find the money?
Yes.
I pointed out to you that the principal of EP secretarial school, miser that he is, will remain merciless, that he will not hear of your returning unless I pay, unless you are carrying the money in your hands, right or wrong.
Right.
Aha! Now, let's turn our attention to that object there, that machine, that typewriter. After you've gone out and returned home, here will the last installment on that typewriter, which you need for your training, be paid. Okay?
No.
Good. So you agree there is need.
Oh, I know it.
And on whom is the burden of that need?
On you, Father.
Well said, correct. Then, in that case, let me turn your attention to me a little. Take a look at my condition. I'm not young, and yet what are my prospects? To what can I look forward? After you've gone out and returned home, here, will my hope for a more comfortable future be any better? The mattress on which I try to rest my bones after each day's up and down, will it have changed from a straw-stuffed lumpy mattress to a soft, bouncy Dunlopillow?
No. Oh, Father, please.
I haven't finished. Apart from things like that, and above all, when you return, will there be a better leak-proof roof over our heads, let alone some comfortable chairs to sit in, a fridge in the kitchen, a car in the garage, my name on invitation lists for state functions, embassy parties? Tell me, will I be able to go to memorial services this week in a fine cloth, next week in a suit or a different cloth? Will I be able, if I go, to thrust my hand confidently into my pocket in public and take out a 5-guinea donation?
Father, you have said enough, please.
Let me add 1 or 2 more things. Imagine a great congregation at church on an important occasion. It's time for the collection. There sits the priest. There stands the gleaming collection plate in everybody's view. They call out, "Those born on Sunday, those born on Sunday." The Cubices Isis rise, walk up, and deposit their money in the plate. Those born on Monday, the Kadwus and the Adwas, file their deposit. It's coming soon to those born on Wednesday, mark you, to the Quikas and Equas. And my name is Leku. Tell me, how many times have I missed going to church because there is nothing in my pocket to deposit in full view of the public? And after you have gone out and returned home here, will I be any better off for going to church?
I implore you, Father, I'm ready.
Finally, when I breathe my last and die, will my coffin be drawn in a fine private hearse instead of a municipal hearse? Will the people who come to my funeral eat salad and small chops and drink good whiskey instead of chewing bits of cola and drinking cheap gin and diluted Fanta? Tell me.
Father, why? I thought you...
Begin the typing. Dear Chief of SAPRA.
So, Father, do you desire all those things? Haven't you condemned many of them often and often? You have poo-pooed them, have you not?
Of course I have. Some of them are absolutely absurd, empty vanities. But you see, my child, I'm trying to use this index to show you how all is not well at home. So set your machine talking to help your father out. As a result of a most severe cracking of my brains, I am at least able to see a little hope gleaming in our future, and I'm directing my steps towards it.
Yes.
Step by step, my feet are in motion under the direction of my mind, and I'm on the road to free you and me from what? I'm not saying I want that much, but what if a few things can come my way? If a few things can come. I'm not saying I'll eat chicken every day, but what about a little fish today and tomorrow, a little meat on which I can count? I'm not saying my only daughter, Anansiwa, must become a judge of the Supreme Court, but what about her finishing her secretarial course? And perhaps...
He's forgotten I'm here. This absent-mindedness of fathers is most trying. Oh, Father, please hurry.
What's that? What?
Ready, the typing. Excellent portrayal. The other person, of course, who I talk about is Amata Edu, and I hope some of you were able to read some of her poems of that recent collection. She's just, incredible. A little younger than Sutherland, so not as connected to the government in a way. And I think her work shows that. And she's written. There's some of her plays. This is a book of short stories that came out only a few years ago. Our Sister Killjoys is a remarkable novel about someone going on a kind of journey to Germany and Britain and coming back. She has a really strange, it's like a Fassbinder scene. This kind of Bavarian woman falls in love with her in the shadow of some castle. And there's a lot I could say about that, but it'll take too much time. She has novels. That's a photo of her with Swaginka over there. I don't know what their relationship is, but they seem like they are fond of each other. It's probably kind of annoying when your male friends win all the prizes all the time, but I'm sure she's gracious about it. I met her once at a conference in Santa Barbara, and she's really sort of witty and lovely and wonderful. And she's the only subject that I write about who's still living, which I think is interesting. She has two key plays, and both of them deal with slavery, which is taboo, completely sort of out of the norm for the culture she's coming from. And she wrote them when she was young, so she's talked about that as just being a kind of foolishness. One is about an American woman from Harlem who speaks in this funny made-up Black American dialect, who comes home with her, transnational boyfriend to his family's village, and they can't even communicate, and it causes a lot of conflict. Another is about a historic scene of a family who, a woman who picks a man, and then he decides that they should start acquiring slaves, which ends up sort of tearing everything apart. So there's a monologue from a Noah, if you feel like coming to do it, that would be cool. So this is a Noah speaking about a dream she had. Yeah, it's all the yellow stuff.
I remember once, I think I was very young then, quite young certainly. Perhaps I was 8 or 10, perhaps I was 12. My grandmother told me of her travels. She told of the great places she had been to and the wonderful things she had seen, of the sea that is bigger than any river and boils without being hot, of huge houses rising to touch the skies, houses whose foundations are wider than the biggest roads I had ever seen. They contained more rooms than were in all the homes I knew put together. Of these houses I asked, "Tell me, Nana, who built the houses?" She said, "Why do you want to know?" "The pale men. Who are the pale men?" I asked, "You ask too many questions." "They are the white men." "Who are the white men?" I asked. "A child like you should not ask questions. They come from far away from beyond the horizon." "Nana, what do they look like?" I asked. "Shut up, child. Not like you or me," she said. "But what do they look like, Nana?" I asked. "Shut up, child, or your mouth will twist up one day with questions." "Not like you or me?" "Yes, like you or me, but different." "What do they look like, Nana? What devil has entered into you, child, as if you or I were peeled of our skins, like a lobster that is boiled or roasted, but it is not good that a child should ask questions." "Nana, why did they build the big houses?" I asked. "I must escape from you, child. They say they built the big houses to keep slaves." What is a slave, Nana? Shut up! It is not good that a child should ask such big questions. A slave is the one who is bought and sold. Where did white men get the slaves, I asked. You frighten me, child. You must be a witch, child. They got them from the land. Did the men of the land sell other men of the land? And did women and children to pale men from beyond the horizon who looked like you or me, peeled like lobsters, boiled or roasted? I do not know, child. You are frightening me, child. I was not there. It is too long ago. No one talks of these things anymore. All good men and women try to forget. They have forgotten. What happened to those who were taken away? Do people hear from them? How are they? Shut up, child. It is too late, child. Sleep well, child. All good men and women try to forget. They have forgotten. That night, I woke up screaming hot, my body burning and sweating from a horrible dream. I dreamt that I was a big, big woman, and from my insides were huge holes out from which poured men, women, and children. And the sea was boiling hot and steaming, and as it boiled, it threw out many giant lobsters, boiled lobsters, each of whom, as it fell, turned into a man or woman, but keeping lobster head and claws. And they rushed where I sat and seized the men and women as they poured out of me and tore them apart, and dashed them to the ground and stamped upon them. And from their huge courtyards the women ground my men and women and children on mountains of stone. But there was never a cry or a murmur, only a bursting, as of a ripe tomato or a swollen pod. And everything went on and on and on. I was very ill and did not recover for weeks. When I told my dream, the women of the house were very frightened. They cried and cried and cried and told me not to mention the dream again. For some time there was talk of apprenticing me to a priestess. I don't know what came of it, but since then, any time there is mention of a slave, I see a woman who is me, and a bursting of a ripe tomato or a swollen pod. Yeah, that's it.
That was great. Thank you. They did a production at UC Santa Barbara when they were doing this conference in honor of her, and you see, they kind of got all the black and brown people, plus like the white guys who can do African drumming, and the white girls who can do West African dance, and put them in a cat. And we can think about that and talk about it. I would much rather see these plays done than not, I guess is the short answer that I would mention. There's a National Theater building in Accra now where the drama studio once stood, and it's this weird structure that nobody really understands, but it was a kind of political project. China built it for Ghana, and then erased the debt, and then recently refurbished it for Ghana and recently erased the debt again. Edu has a poem after the ceremonies about this that might be worth taking a look at. It's a strange scene that deals with some of a lot of the questions sort of are embodied there. Just another little bit from this chapter. The ambivalent figure of tradition can be quite problematic in the African context. As Paulin Ntunji has pointed out, as in Nkrumah's own writing, the idea of tradition is often conjured to locate aspects of African cultures that extend a genealogical lineage into the Africa that preceded colonization. As Ntunji argues, the adjective traditional and the phrase traditional African civilization must be banished once and all because it favors a pernicious misconception. In practice, the phrase is used to mean, quote, pre-colonial African civilization, but again, only in the sense of a purely conventional historic division. But when instead of this neutral phrase, we use the more vivid phrase, traditional African civilization, we had a value connotation, and pre-colonial civilization as a whole is being contrasted with so-called modern civilization. That is to say, colonial and post-colonial civilization with the connotation highly westernized, as if they were two essentially distinct systems of value. The pre-colonial history of Africa is condensed into a single synchronic picture whose points exist simultaneously and are uniformly opposed to the points in different synchronic chart. Symmetrical with the first, the two being distinguished in terms of what is taken to be the only important division in the history of the continent, the moment of colonization. Ntunji is highly critical of the simplifying misconception of tradition. It is used to reduce diverse interactions of cultures, languages, and ideologies into a synchronic picture, which emphasizes colonization as the focal transformative event in African history. He argues African cultures are not stable condensations frozen in time, nor are the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras discontinuous with each other. The term traditional can be used to recuperate a unified totality that never existed. It also acts to render African originality incompatible with westernized modernity. In the African context, tradition and modernity tend to reduce multiple historical differences into a fallacious binary. Ntunji is equally critical of the broader ideological synthesis imposed by Nkrumahism. In his 1964 book, Consciencism, Nkrumah proposes that neologism to describe a movement that would resolve Du Bois's double consciousness and counter the primacy of the conscious Western subject. Echoing other early writings, Nkrumah imagines a subject who could assimilate centuries of European and Arab influences into an African personality, a character that resonates with an authentic African past. While tidily prescribing this ideological synthesis, Nkrumah locates within it African communalist tendencies that will cohere with modern socialism. I'm going to sort of skip through this part. In the end, proposing that the kind of unanimity of African personality is a kind of impossible synthesis, and that's something that I read through those plays of these writers, where all of these elements exist and don't come to a kind of tidy conclusion in any case. I just want to throw in here this popular form. This theater form is not like hugely popular. There's a tradition in Ghana called concert party that came out of the 1920s that involves these three-person comic troupes. They have influences from movies like The Jazz Singer, but I believe they started even before that one was really distributed, and have these kind of tropes of city versus country and the usual kind of comic circumstances. They use blackface still to this day, and there's a book by Catherine Cole about this theater that's really interesting, and a bunch of documentaries she made. It's all on YouTube. And if you ask them about that, they say, it's clown makeup. What's the big deal? What's your problem, Americans? Chill out. It's also very much tied to the high life music of the area, which also incorporates string, guitar music from sailors and brass music from English marching bands and other kinds of instrumentation that are more local in these kinds of events. And the troupe roll into the town and set up in the middle of the town, and one of these plays will go on for 9 hours, and everyone just kind of hangs out. It's a sort of really interesting form that I kind of identified with. And on the right is, it sort of reached television. We're 12:30. I'm just gonna keep going, is that okay? I don't know, I have a different section that I wanted to get to, but I'm gonna do it. I'm here, you're here. This is from the afterword. Throughout these pages, I have argued that the raising of different possibilities in performance can be a transformative act. But clearly the 60s and its performances did not altogether revolutionize familiar powers. Economic exploitation, white supremacy, and patriarchy endure. Their reprisals are as discouraging as ever. Whether this is a failure of the 60s, as is sometimes asserted, or a failure of the present might be worth discussing. The performances I have described suggest that failure and success are not reliable measures. Possibility confirms the co-occurrence of failure and success, and the way negativity is engendered even in a positivist result. Here is a condition blackness shares with the idea of possibility. Among its iterations exists at least a doubling of that which definitely is with that which simply cannot. The antagonism so vexing to Dr. Du Bois has outlived him significantly. Race has cleaved its way into the 21st century, organizing disjunctions that have extended modernity's reach. Of special relevance to performance studies has been the expansion of representational technologies, their images distributed throughout an intensified sphere of visuality, which organizes authority and power around what is seen. This sphere continues to affirm the immanence of blackness as commodity, narrative structure, and identification. It is exchanged as a volatile arrangement of values. It compels dramatic action around conflict and strife, and it activates a position from which to speak and to discourse. By now, these processes have played out across a wide swath of historical time, and still today, blackness's performative repertoire is called upon as insistently as ever. Blackness is exhausting activity. The idea of excess that I have drawn from a retrospective understanding of the 60s, a sense that order could be recuperated by declaring that the 60s were too much, resists that very recontainment. The hope that revolutionary utopian outcomes are just around the corner may be more remote now than it was within the radical political movements of that time. Under different historical conditions, the volatility of black performance continues to destabilize categorical distinctions and radicalize its context. Importantly, the alienations, demands for multiplicitous production, global flows, and general ambivalences of contemporary capitalist life are well met by blackness, which has developed a language for addressing those very conditions. This resemblance between blackness and contemporary economic conditions should not be mistaken for collusion. Resistance, a force so evident in those performances of the 60s, still activates black performances that find themselves persistently interested in that history. Today, there is the opportunity to include among blackness's ambivalent techniques an ambivalent approach to the 60s and its politics. Within that, radical energy persists and can be deployed apart from linear claims of historical progress that appear to disprove themselves. This concluding section reads that energy from the point of view of 2015, locating modes of resistant representations that have exceeded the 60s, offering a system of resistance's reach and flexibility. Situated in this moment, I approach this concluding section from the subjective position of a black performer with the hope of intensifying the presence of black performance. From the spring to fall of 2015, inside a centuries-old brick watchtower backed against the historic port of Venice, Italy, 10 black audio speakers were installed at ear level surrounding the space. The speakers delivered the voices of 10 singers singing the German national anthem in 10 African languages. One voice began and others joined until a chorus surrounded the listener with overlapping languages, performing the same heavy tune, the song of the Germans, in Douala, Igbo, Lingala, Bamun, Kikongo, Yoruba, Sango, More, Tree, and Owondo. Each time the song began, again a different voice, a different language, and again the others filled in the chorus. I encountered this work by Emeka Ogbo in the exhibition organized for the 56th Venice Biennial, a regularly prestigious art show which in 2015 included an unprecedented number of black artists from the United States, Europe, and Africa. The biennial's curator, Okoye Nwezor, a Nigerian man who has held curatorial and academic posts in Europe and the United States, is the only black person ever to have been appointed to that job. I made the trip to see the show and to celebrate the occasion with friends and colleagues and my artist father, whose work was included. The Venice Biennial was founded in 1895 and still maintains a World's Fair quality connected to that time, with its national art pavilions and international group exhibition, assembling a diversity of modernities and modernisms that have by now been assimilated into globalist exchange. While the art world's set of destinations maintains a regular practice of pilgrimage for the artists, curators, writers, collectors, and other professionals who do its work, this particular event, given its participants, was of anomalous interest as an object of black study. While there, I was enlisted to participate in a performance by musicians Alicia Hall Moran and Jason Moran. On my last day in Venice, I worked through their piece from a central stage, and then, with suitcase in tow, I set out to see the far reaches of the gigantic exhibition and discovered there Ogbo's tower, and hearing those voices singing that song, I found myself moved. Ogbo's piece is an example of music transporting historical resonances across time, troubling ontologies along the way. While emphasizing the place of song and of oral traditions in the making of Black subjectivity, I don't wish here to romanticize sound as an unfettered force that necessarily leads to liberation, but rather wish to consider sound's flexible communicative powers within visuality, even when conscribed to the fixities of its discipline. Following scholars of Black musical production, this history suggests what Tavia Nyong'o has described as a demand to, quote, listen to the Black body as a musical and technical instrument that resounds at frequencies that confound its routinized, racialized instrumentation. The works discussed here elaborate on music as, in Shauna Redmond's words, quote, a method of rebellion and revolution and future visions. And Weizer's exhibition was insidiously aural, carefully distributing sounds orchestration around objects, video installations, and live interventions. His performance selections moved away from the body and toward its voice. A central arena stage built for reading and performances served as a platform for the voice of the biennial. This emphasis on sound in a visual art context offered modes that exceed the auspices of visuality. Distributed around the space of the biennial, sound offered echoes of a resistant past while announcing possible futures. Meka Ogbo's Song of the Germans raises important connections between history, nationalism, and performance, as in those unpacked by Judith Butler and Gayatri Spivak in their text, Who Sings the Nation State? The anthem, originally composed by Joseph Haydn for an imperial birthday, rises and falls in the manner of Western music's most satisfying melodic mode. It was used in German unification efforts in the 1840s as various principalities were becoming a state. A nationalistic poem was set to the melody at that time, the third stanza of which is the anthem of today's reunified Germany. This is the stanza adapted by Ogbo and the singers, who are members of an Afro-German gospel choir based in Berlin. The stanza calls for the principles Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, unity and justice and freedom, reflective of the Enlightenment terms that generally informed the development of the most orderly nation states. There are other original stanzas of the song that are no longer used. The second celebrates German women, German loyalty, German wine, and German song, offering a seemingly medieval premise for the modern project. These features are celebrated as elements of an essential past which inspires future deeds, emanating from their alten schönen Klang, old beautiful tone. Sound carries this historicity into the future, as in the song's self-reflexive reference to song itself, and never mind that Haydn was Austrian. The notion that women are either abstractions, like loyalty, or cultural products, like wine, rather than agents of a unified, just, and free history, is out of step with the Germany of Angela Merkel and partially accounts for the stanza's relegation to history. A founding national identity also pushes through the other stanza that is never officially sung, the first, which begins Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, and is closely associated in the imagination with the National Socialist regime. Its opening declaration is perhaps the most familiar aspect of the song to non-Germans, given the breadth of the conquering project it accompanied in the 30s and 40s. For me, at least, hearing the anthem's melody conjures those words more readily than unity, justice, or freedom. This content is accompanied by the melody's affective strength, its conveyance of beauty and resolution, reinforcing the rightness of that claim. It reminds me in some ways of Dixie, the unofficial anthem of the Confederate States of America, which, using mannered sentimentality rather than courtly elegance, also conveys a melancholic past that underscores a desired future. That pretty tune romanticizes the southern US it describes through a longing that is something like what Germans call Sehnsucht, and never mind that Dixie was written in Chicago for a minstrel show. In 2015, Germany's political strength as economic arbiters for the EU was a tense political matter. Some German visitors to Venice expressed to me a sense of resentment they recognized while traveling in Southern Europe. An activist art action at the German Pavilion referencing Greece's current debt crisis denounced Germany's austerity policies. The artist Hito Sterl's video installation, Factory of the Sun, inside that same pavilion expressed a highly critical attitude toward the German financial sector, and even offered a sarcastic gesture linking that sector to Nazism. While such a comparison may be hyperbolic, the problem with German power is again a European concern. The raciality of that national power resonates in Ogbo's Tower, sung in those 10 languages, some of which come from the former German colonial territory, the patriotic song is articulated in utterances that to most Germans may as well be Greek. In Who Sings the Nation State, Butler describes protesters in California singing the American national anthem in Spanish as an intense act of resistance. Reading Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben, Butler keeps the nation-state's extraordinary ordering abilities in view while imagining how the movement in and out of territory and citizenship choreographs challenges to state power. This is Butler. A certain distance or fissure becomes the condition of possibility of equality, which means that equality is not a matter of extending or augmenting the homogeneity of the nation. Of course, this might be no more than a pluralism which, as we know, reinstalls homogeneity only after a little complexity is admitted into the fold. But if we consider this both as plural act and as speech and translation, then it seems to me that we witness at least two conditions that are at work, not only in the assertion of equality, but in the exercise of freedom. Both the ontologies of liberal individualism and this idea of a common language are forfeited in favor of a collectivity that comes to exercise its freedom in a language or a set of languages for which difference and translation are irreducible. Butler recognizes at least two conditions in a common action that resists homogenizing state force in one move while maintaining difference through translation in another. As Spivak observes in Conversation, the national anthem, unlike the international or We Shall Overcome, is untranslatable. In this example and in Ogbo's piece, we observe the loss of the nationalistic requirement in translation, and with it, its unifying demand. Patriotism lacks continuity without the authorizing and authenticating claim that would be laid by common use of the national language. Ogbo was born in 1977 in Enugu, Nigeria, and he's a contemporary artist based in both Lagos and Berlin, whose work have exploited sounds politicizing effective powers. Ogbo is the winner of a German competition commissioning a public artwork for the planned African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which I think is done now, the construction of which is also backed by Germany. In his proposed work, Ogbo is to build a sound installation using the anthem of the African Union, Let Us All Unite and Celebrate Together, but also recordings of speeches delivered in 1963 at the opening of an older organization, the Organization of African Unity, at the high point of African independence. In her book Anthem, Redmond describes comparable political songs that resist nationalist participation in favor of extra-national affinities. The black and interracial, this is Redmond, the black and interracial organizations that these anthems represent serve to rebut, reorient, or reimagine the state's role in the lives of black citizens, a strategy characteristic of black transnationalism in the 60s. Let Us All Unite and Celebrate Together announces this historic intention and represents it as an occasion for festive pleasure, accessing an effect produced by collective singing in connection to new forms of belonging. I'm just going to read one more paragraph. Reflecting the moment's utopian possibility, Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah's speech on that occasion called for a politically unified continent that would overcome the neo-colonial forces preventing African economic control over its vast resources. Quote, "So many blessings must flow from our unity, so many disasters must follow on our continued disunity, that our failure to unite today will not be attributed to posterity only to faulty reasoning and lack of courage, but to our capitulation before the forces of imperialism." Nkrumah alludes to the American Constitutional Convention as a model for a post-colonial organization, an image that recalls a founding democratic past while projecting great future power, and delivers a lengthy critique of the ways Africans have been deprived of their own capital and how they may revolutionize that condition, articulating his African Marxist analysis. Nkrumah's extraordinary plan, which called for new cooperative bodies, a new common currency, common citizenship, common defense, and other major innovations, was not put into effect. Instead, the Organization of African Unity, which came to serve autocratic rather than cooperative states, was finally dissolved in 2002 and replaced with the African Union, which now looks to Germany to build its headquarters. In both of these works by Ogbo, the problem of Einigkeit resonates, as sound carries, or is proposed to carry, presence, history, and possibility with ambivalence. The time between Nkrumah's predictions and today's past holds big disappointments that shadow political promises. In the case of the Lied der Deutschen, the music unfurls the banners of globalist present, and by implication, fascist and imperial legacies that linger behind the voices. Even within this intractable history, African singularities surround the listener in possibility, confounding the meanings that confine it. I'm going to stop reading. I had a couple more works I was going to rush through. Emeka Ogbo made a fake African beer that, in this sort of video and installation, is proposed to have taken over the entire German beer market. There was a show at the Ludlow space at the Goethe Institute, runs in Manhattan, that I saw. I just was in Berlin at this biennial and was looking at this Okwasili piece, which uses a particular women's revolt from the 20s in Nigeria as a way to stage a kind of transmission of actions that's installed in this kind of dance piece that picks up cues and responds to visitors in the room. And then I wrote a short essay for a catalog for Njideka Akunyili Crosby that I just have sort of a draft of now, and I was going to share with you, including you painting experts, to see what you thought, but there's really not time.